There we go. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you here. A lot of you are getting very smart and you're coming into the room early. You know that I come early, and as soon as I opened it up, it was like boom, 50 people were there. It was great. Hi, Mark Halbert. Hi, Mark. Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Yes. I hold on to your email about Grace, right? I know, sorry, I can't hear you. Let me see. Whoops. I'm going to ask you to unmute. There
Yeah,
we go. Hi, Mark.
yeah,
Hi.
thanks for that. I'm for a busy person, I didn't expect you to come back to me on that one, but and it looks like I'm the only man here, am I?
Nope, I'm sure you're not. We have Michael Shelton. I see Michael. And if I scroll away here, we are
Okay.
fortunate to have, yes, we have men that join us. Not a lot, but, or you know what? I tell myself, Mark, that we do have men. They're just hiding behind phone numbers. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. All right. Anyway, nice to see you here, Mark. Thanks for being here. Yes. All right, everybody, welcome to you. I'm so glad you're all here, and I'm really excited to spend the next hour with you. And my dear friend and mentor, Joan Borysenko, who is just a love. And Joan, thank you for being here with all of us. As I told you on the phone, we've been doing this series I'm calling it a series, but I've been meeting with the people in my community now for the last several months, talking about all kinds of things related to really staying awake and conscious and improving our wisdom years. So sort of post midlife. And anybody who joins that's at midlife or before midlife is lucky because they're getting a whole bunch of important, valuable wisdom beforehand so that they can make good choices as they age. So, Joan, I thought maybe we could start by just having you, could you just introduce yourself for, well, let's do it this way. From a kind of spiritual dimension perspective, let's have you introduce yourself to these wonderful people who I'm sure there's only two that don't know who you are, but let's let them know and we'll get it on record.
Oh, that's so kind of you, my darling. Well, first of all, how long have I known you, Cheryl? Over 30 years, right?
Long time, really
Yes,
long.
a very long time because we're both Hay House authors. But I have an interesting background because my life's work has been combining science and spirit. And originally, I was a cancer cell biologist trained and in practice at Harvard Medical School. And through the years, I've had so many mystical experiences. And experiences, I opened a mind body clinic. It started during the AIDS epidemic at one of the Harvard teaching hospitals. And people immediately jumped to the spiritual dimension of life in that difficult time as they tried to grope with the meaning of what is AIDS, what is this new illness, what is my incarnation all about. And over the period of my life, I've been fortunate in that clinic. We had people with cancer, people with AIDS, people with stress related disorders. And I'd have to say that these were my teachers. But also, all my life, I've been fascinated with different spiritual tradition, from things like indigenous traditions. I've been very fortunate to be able to study with the Lakota because I knew a medicine man who specialized in the healing of cancer and to study what healing is in different dimensions. Along the way, when I realized my joy was not in test tubes, although I was fascinated, why does the body create cancer cells and how can we cure it? That led me to the mind body connection. And that, of course, really, Cheryl, has been where I've spent a great deal of my life, seeing that there really is no difference between mind, body, and spirit. They're all expressions of the same basic thing, which is the gift of human life. So There you go, in a very large nutshell.
Thank you. Thank you, Joan. Thank you. So before we begin our conversation, I just want to let everybody know this is being recorded. It will be available. I know there's some people that always try to want to record this, but we always record them. We'll make it available on our website, usually within 24 hours. If you go right to the homepage, you'll be able to see the notice about Zoom gatherings, and you'll find it. If you click on that, it'll take you right to the page, and you'll be able to see the video of Joan and I talking today. And we're also going to hold off on the chat. We'll open the chat up for questions once we have a little bit of a conversation here together. So, Joan, today's conversation is about keeping a spotlight on the spiritual dimension of life. And I think of that in terms of the reason for that is because as we age, we're confronted with a lot of things. Like we really can't control the world. We can't control our world, and God knows we're really experiencing that on a big level right now. A lot of people are feeling anxious and out of control. And we don't really deal very effectively, particularly in the US, with grief and loss, right? And death and dying. We don't like to talk about it. One of my publishers, when I talked to them about wanting to write about death and dying, they said, no, no, we've polled our readers and they don't want to hear about that. I thought, okay, I think that they just don't want to hear about it in the way that you presented it, because ultimately, I think, as we age, we want to be able to, I don't even want to say make peace with death and dying, but form a relationship with it, I guess is what I want to say. And so to me, focusing on the spiritual dimension of life is what helps us to deal with loss, to deal with aging, to deal with the loss of physical functioning maybe or our energy, and to deal ultimately with our own demise. So I thought we could start by I'd love to just hear you talk a little bit about how you view or how you define, if you can, the spiritual dimension of life for yourself.
That is always an interesting question, isn't it? Well, I'm going to quote a mentor of mine, Rachel Naomi Remen. Some of you know her from her books, Kitchen Table Wisdom, Stories of Healing, stories of her grandfather. And Rachel said something that always has stuck with me, and that is religion is a bridge to the spiritual, but the spiritual lies beyond religion. And sometimes, unfortunately, people get stuck on the bridge. And so when I think about it, some people's religious traditions really have illuminated their hearts, given them an experience of deep connection with other people, with nature, with themselves, and given them a sense that something larger is afoot in our life. There's some source of intelligence that guides us, that helps us, and that we're in a continual source of becoming our better selves and in touch with that larger sense of spirit. If I had to define it in a sentence, I'd say spirituality is all about our deep sense of connection and presence to what is in any moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would say the same thing when I thought about it, knowing I was going to ask you this question. I thought, well, how would I define the spiritual dimension of life? And I think what I would say is that anything that the spiritual dimension of life to me is the life that unfolds when we're present.
Yes.
And being present is sort of the foundation of it all, right? And what it's a huge learning task for all of us. It's a lifelong practice of coming back to the present moment.
Yes, it's a lifelong practice, and we get there in a variety of different ways. And I want to share a story with you because this happened in the late 1980s when I was sitting at people's deathbeds frequently because I was running a clinic for people with AIDS. before we even knew what caused the illness. And that has a way of bringing us very present. Our mind is not wandering so much to past or future, but we are like, what's happening now? And during that time, a little bit later in the 80s, my mother was dying, and I got to sit at her deathbed. And I want to say that I come from a Jewish family, but my mother was an atheist and my father was an agnostic. And the reason for my mother's atheism was the Holocaust. And she said, how do innocent people die? Why do babies die? If God is some loving presence that sees everything. She could never reconcile that. And I think for many of us, we're still trying to reconcile how could the universe be loving when there's so much suffering, so much difficulty in the world? So I was sitting with my mother as she was dying, and I'm going to make the most amazing story of my life as short as I can, with hopefully not losing the heart and the light of it. So I was sitting on one side of my mother's bed. My son, Justin, who was 20 at the time, was sitting on the other side. And by the way, I would say that some people are so tuned in spiritually that they just know what to do at a time like that. My son crawled into bed with my mother as she was dying. And then he said to me, let's sing to her. What's the song that she and my father danced to for their first song, which was Some Enchanted Evening? And
Mhm.
as we sang that, you know, she was already in touch, she thought, with my father on the other side. For an atheist, this was a strange thing when she looks at us and said, oh, do you think Eddie is really waiting there for me? That's my dad. So time progressed. The doctor came in. She had a shot of morphine, and that was her last bit of consciousness. So at this point, we're sitting, Justin and I, my son and I, sitting on opposite side of her bed, about 3 in the morning. And suddenly, I felt a shift. I felt, first of all, wide awake, more awake than I'd ever been in my life. But it was like a jolt that something, I was in a different state of consciousness and awake for the first time in my life, that I was experiencing something realer than real. And what happened was suddenly I found myself like not having a vision, but being in the vision because it was real. And in the vision, I was a pregnant mother giving birth, but I was also the baby being born. And the insight was so funny to me. And I said, oh my God, I get it. God is like a case of multiple personality disorder in everything. And in fact, there's only one of us here. And then the baby came through the birth canal. That was its own experience, but out into the light. And so suddenly I'm in the same light that I had heard so many of my patients talk about. And in fact, it is indescribable. It is ineffable because the light is loving kindness itself. The light is mercy. And in the light, the realization is this light knows everything about your life. It knows all your mistakes, all your beauty, all the crazy little things you have done. And it views them all as the maturation of your soul, that there is no judgment. There was never any judgment. And, you know, I was having the experience, but still witnessing it. And it was at a time, Cheryl, when my inner critic was having its way with me. And I was so judgmental and critical of myself. And suddenly, like, bam, totally dissipated. There's nothing here but unbounded mercy and loving kindness. And then all I can say is that light felt like a cheering section for my soul. He that's witnessing is saying, what is the light? The light is not God. What is the light? You know, the scientist never shuts up in there. Can I define it? And then I realized, no, of course not. I cannot define it. But oh, the sensation. Then the light showed me a series of 7 or 8 vignettes, like a life review. But it was a life review of my mother and me. And the vignettes were all things that I would have considered difficult things we'd been through together because we didn't get along real well. And I saw how the disagreements themselves were growing both of our souls. And so this was incredible. And that at a certain point, after the 7 or 8 vignettes, it was simply over. And I opened my eyes. But here's the thing, the room was like filled with light. And probably everybody there, you all had a chemistry teacher, I'm sure, who said everything is made out of light. Everything is made out of energy. It only looks solid, your desk, but it isn't. If you knew, it's just light. And so that was it. Everything was light, but I could see both light and form. My mother had now died. And actually, the last thought I had was my mother gave birth to me in this realm, and I just birthed her soul into another realm. And so I look across her now empty body, and there's my son, Justin, and he is glowing like a Renaissance portrait. He had a halo, and he was weeping, he was crying, and honest to God, Cheryl, little rainbows came out of his tears as they were running down his face. He looked at me with such soft, alive eyes, and he says, Mom, the room is filled with light. Can you see it? And I
Oh,
said, oh, yes, I see it. And with such reverence, he said, it's Grandma's last gift. She's holding open the door to eternity so that we can have a gift. Then I ran over and sat next to him, and he said, I had a vision, Mom. And he said, I can't believe it. And I kept repeating it. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. He said, Grandma was a very great soul. And she took a role in this life so much smaller than who she was to serve you. And he looked at me, and this is a 20-year-old kid who's like, relationship with mom, well, but he he says to me, you're supposed to be a teacher of love, and you couldn't really understand love unless you hadn't been loved so well and had something to resist. And she was the one who gave you that gift. They said, you must be so grateful to her. And let me tell you, I think I've never been so grateful to anyone or anything in my life as the gratitude that filled me at that moment. And then Justin plucked me up by the arms. And there was a song, Happy, Happy, Joy, Joy, by Ren and Stimpy. And there we were in the middle of the night dancing around my mother's empty body, singing to her soul, Happy, Happy, Joy, Joy. I have to say that I'd had many spiritual, mystical experiences before and since, but what this tells me and that I hold dearly in my heart is that beyond all of our doubts, beyond all of our fears, beyond all the appearances of separation and difference, the ultimate reality of this universe is that it is made of loving kindness and is infinitely merciful. So that's still informs me, when I go
Good.
to bed at night and I'm just being grateful for my day and reviewing it a bit, then I bring back the memory of being in the presence of the being of light. And that's how I fall asleep at night.
Wow. Wow. It's a really beautiful story, Joan. I don't I don't quite know where there's nowhere I want to go from there, and there's everywhere I want to go from there at the same time, right? In some ways, as I was listening to you tell the story, first of all, I want to say it is such a sacred experience to be at the bedside of people when they're dying. And I encourage people to have that experience when and if you have the opportunity, because it's not what you think. It's a holy moment, it's a holy experience. I was thinking as you were telling the story, Joan, how I was thinking about unity consciousness,
Yeah.
right? This, in some ways, the spiritual dimension of life is the journey to that kind of oneness, to to the light. I mean, it's so hard to put it into words, as you said, because it's really more of an experience. It's what I love about the Hindu. I read the Bhagavad Gita and read, Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi. I think you and I have that in common. We did the lessons. And one of the things I loved about Yogananda's work was, they talked about the experience of God being the priority over the theology, right? And when I think about the experience or spirit, and I hear your story, I know that what my soul longs for, and I think what all of our souls long for, whether we can articulate it or not, is to have that sense of aliveness that you had, of mercy, especially with ourselves first, right? That feeling of being in that sort of grateful, loving place that almost spontaneously brings tears to your eyes, which is all born from presence. I mean, there's nothing like a dying mother or a dying loved one to bring you into the present moment, as you said. You're not thinking about anything else. As a matter of fact, I know I had a dear friend of mine, Lucy, which you've heard about before. That was my first experience of being with someone when they died, and she had no family, and she asked me to, if I would help her get her affairs in order. And at first I said, absolutely not. I didn't want to be anywhere near death. I thought, are you kidding me? I can't do that. But I was so much of a codependent at that time. I thought, I can't leave this poor woman to like deal with this on her own. So I agreed. It was the best decision of my life. And it was a turning point spiritually for me because we spent the next 3 months very practically going through dismantling her life and knowing who was going to get what. And the night that she died, she was in a hospital. I was in bed, about to go to sleep, and it was midnight. Something told me to get up. I called the hospital. They said, she's not long for this world. You probably want to come in first thing tomorrow morning. And I hung up the phone and thought, no, I'm going to go in now. And I drove an hour into Boston to the hospital. And when I got up to her room, they had moved her to a private room. And at that time, I was reading everything I could get my hands on that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had written. You remember her?
Yeah.
And yeah, I was studying death. I wanted to be well prepared. That's how I was sort of, dealing with things. And I sat by Lucy's side, and she was pretty unconscious at this point, just laying there. And I started to go over all of the things that she had told me she wanted done when she died. I wanted to like let her know. I didn't know what else to do. I thought, I just went through the list. Here's everything I'm going to do. You don't have to worry, because Elizabeth Kubler-Ross told stories of how, you know, if a mother was dying, and the child, was saying, "No, mommy, no," the mother would feel pulled to come back. And I knew it was time for Lucy to go. She had wanted to go. And as I was doing that, all of a sudden she opened her eyes and she lifted her head and she looked right at me. And I swear she was completely illuminated. It was as if her face, much like you were saying, it was dark, but the room didn't turn light, but she was just a beaming light. And she looked right at me and she smiled.
Ah,
She closed her eyes, put her head back down, and took her last breath. And like you, even when I say that, I can feel that experience in my body, like you can. And that was my first introduction to the fact that when we get close to death, we get close to spirit and we start to alleviate our fear,
mhm.
And so when you think about cultivating this sense of aliveness and presence, and I almost want to say, what gives us our best chance at having those kind of illuminating, mystical experiences that can remind us of what really matters in life? What kinds of things come to mind for you?
Having wonderful friends with whom you can be real and to feel like free of the ego. This person isn't going to judge me. I'm not judging them. We're just meeting heart to heart, whatever it may be about, whether you're laughing about something together, crying about something together, the experiences are real. And I think cultivating good friendships, when people say, "What can I do to stay centered in a world that's gone crazy?" I think for most of us, we say, what centers us? Our friends, nature, and music. For many people, music is a bridge to the spiritual. I know that's a big part of my daily spiritual practice is music that brings me into presence, that kind of opens me up and gives me that sense of aliveness. Aliveness, it's it can be an excited feeling, it can be a peaceful feeling, but it's greater than either one of us can really express. That sense of aliveness for me is I know something real is happening. Sometimes it comes to people, when you read a book and some passage from that book comes alive for you and it makes you alive. I'll tell you a little story about that. The book that falls off the shelf. We have all had that experience. Well, recently, one of my husband's, Gordon's, many, many books, and it was a book written by Christopher Alexander, who's an architect who talks about making nature, being so in tune with nature that your home looks like it grew out of nature itself. And he's quite a philosopher. And so the book, I really did. I was walking by and the thing fell off the shelf. Pick it
Mhm.
up, I open it up, and there's a section, and it says, um, making wholeness heals the maker. And I thought to myself, if I was a needlepoint artist, I'd make that and like put it on the wall like of an old farmhouse. Making wholeness heals the maker. And I thought the feeling of aliveness, that's what healing really is. And when I make wholeness, like your beautiful house, you and Michael made wholeness, you made nature. And I think the create, the creative impulse when we want to make something, whether it's a flower garden or I'm a mosaic artist, I make mosaics, or when I'm knitting something or crocheting something, I feel so present and I'm making wholeness and I feel that sense of aliveness and presence. So that's another thing, just the creative impulse. We're made
Yeah,
to create. We're made from a consciousness that's so creative. Look what it's created.
I know. Ooh, we're about to have a thunder and lightning storm. So let me just say, Terry, if for some reason, because both Joan and I live in the country, if for some reason we lose power, Terry, I hope you can stay. I hope because you're a co-host, you'll be able to stay on. And Joan, I know you can take over. So because it's right over us, I can see it. Anyway, that's also aliveness. Like I notice, yes, every day, in so many of my books, especially in Waking Up in Winter, which was kind of a memoir of midlife, I wrote about the weather a lot or about like what it looked like outside my window. And at some point I thought, why are you doing that? It's because nature is my connection to God, to the greater intelligence. Like, and the fact that I live in the Northeast where nature changes all the time is just, it keeps me connected to magic, the magic of spirit. And I think that that's a form of aliveness as well. I love that you mention music and good friends and friends that you can be real with. I think that that's so important. We've done Zoom gatherings on friendships and cultivating relationships with people who are just as interested in mutuality and leaving the ego at the door, or at least talking about the ego as a way of kind of witnessing it versus being it, right? Is really important. And music is interesting to me, Joan. I've always been fascinated with psychedelic research. I'm sure you've read a lot about it and probably experienced it yourself. I was recently reading, there's a gentleman who's done a lot of work. I can't think, his first name's Robin. He's from the UK. I can't think of his
Oh,
last,
yes.
you know, who
Yes, yes,
I'm talking
yes.
about. Yeah.
Michael Pollan writes a great deal about his research and his book about the mind.
Exactly. Well, he's talking about, hold on one second. Michael, it's okay. I'm on Zoom with Joan and my community. He thinks there's somebody in the room. It's okay. Don't worry. Anyway, Robin is doing research, and I recently heard an interview with him where he talked about how they are looking at, and he predicts this for the future, they're looking at putting playlists of music together that will create mystical experiences without any drugs at all.
Yes. And I think um, the music, I've always done this for any ritual or, um, one point we had a psychedelic experience and I was the guide at it. And I put together a playlist because music takes you directly into the divine. One one more little story. Back in Boston, this must have been over 30 years ago, maybe close to 40 years ago, before people knew about ayahuasca. There was a psychologist from Peru who knew a psychologist friend of mine and uh, was hosting an ayahuasca experience in a religious sense. There is, religious use called Santo Daime, and it's a Christian kind of ritual that's done in certain parts of Brazil or South America, other places. And what was remarkable about that, this was my first, I'm not a great aficionado. I haven't had a lot of those experiences, but some. And the plant energy is like a teacher that talks to you, in my experience. And it said to me, this ritual is for you because you're going to be talking to thousands of people, and you have to be able to hold a safe space of presence for that. And then I won't go through the whole experience, came up through all the chakras, this incredible, amazing energy. And when it got to the crown chakra, I heard what I could only imagine as the music of the spheres itself. And I had an experience of how the world is created through mathematics and through music, how reality creates all of that, the sacredness of sound, of sacred geometry, of mathematics. It was an amazing experience. And for me, particularly chanting, when the vibration of the music is in your own body, and that the vibration of it is remarkable. And so, Gordon and I do a morning and evening practice, and both of those practices revolve around musical playlists that we have and things that bring us to a sense of presence and deep gratitude. And I find for me, that is the easiest access is chanting music, the body, and of course, nature. I also live in the middle of nowhere, like
Mhm.
you, which is somewhere, river, bird song, seasons, whatever's growing. I think tending life in any way is a spiritual experience. Like people love to garden, to witness the absolute miracle of a seed sprouting, of tending it, of seeing, having to be aware of how much light is it getting? Is there too much sun? Is it getting enough water? And interacting with the expansion of life is a spiritual kind of experience.
The other morning, I was laying in bed, and my little cat, Birdie, who is a ginger tabby cat, jumped up on the bed, and I was laying on my right side, and he laid down next to me, and he put his little head like this so that he was facing my face, we were face to face, and he just stared into my eyes.
Yeah.
Just I just laid there with him, looking into his eyes, and then, just petting his fur and looking at his little ears. And I thought in that moment, like, once again, I was so incredibly present that I felt like I could really see the soul in this little being that had chosen to come into this life with me and to share that moment. And I thought, animals, are so underrated as part of the spiritual dimension of life. As I know, you've got a couple of dogs, and um, there are so many times where, I mean, my cats teach me about letting go of control and not being able to have things the way I want them. I mean, they teach me that every day. They're my little teachers. Um, so let me say this to all of you. We can open the chat, Terry. If there are questions that people have, that would be great. I also want to mention, Joan, I'm almost tempted to say, Joan, I want you to like put together a spiritual playlist, like a playlist of music that we could share with our community. I know we all have different platforms, but I love the fact that you can go on like Spotify or Apple Music or whatever the platform, I forget the other one. I think it begins with a P. Um, you can go on something like that. And if you type in meditation, spiritual, but if you also type in the word atmospheric music, you get some of the best sort of state changing music, which is what we're talking about. I want to mention that because I think you're right, Joan, that people are always looking for ways. We always hear about the importance of meditation. Um, but people are always looking for other ways to connect with that sense of aliveness and presence. And so certainly music, really important. Also on Spotify, remember Bob Monroe, the Monroe Institute,
Of course.
right? So there are plenty of people. What?
I think he had a playlist at one point. Norm Shealy had a playlist. He used to use these tables that you would lie on, and then music would come up and you'd feel the vibration through the table.
Right.
A
That's right.
long history of this.
And you can go on Spotify and I'm sure the other other avenues. And if you put in uh, Monroe or binaural beat, Binaural. I use binaural beats a lot because it just helps people to it helps the mind to calm down, whether you want to or not. It just does right? It brings you into the present moment.
It does. And it is a spiritual practice to create a playlist for yourself. And I'll just say a word about ours. For most people, it wouldn't make sense at all. Both my husband Gordon and I come from Jewish roots, although, I explored everything else for all these years. But Hebrew, like Sanskrit, is a sacred language where every every word has so many dimensions of meaning. And what I did for us was put together a playlist. A lot of it is in Hebrew. And for example, you would love this prayer. There's one sort of beautiful melody in the chant too, but Elohai Neshama Shanatata Bi. Elohai Neshama Shanatata Bi. And it goes on. Elohai Neshama Shanatata Bi Tahorahi. What that means is my soul is pure. The God who gave me life, who created me, gave me a soul that is pure. And to be reminded of that every moment, that underneath the lampshade of daily life and all the experiences, there dwells within you a pure soul, a pure light. And that brings me directly to it. So that's an example of several things that are deeply meaningful. And I just want to add that a lot of people, as they grow up, might love parts of their religion of childhood, even if they feel like, well, I've expanded my point of view beyond that. Nonetheless, the magic of songs from church, of something in Latin, if you're old enough to remember the Latin Mass, those things, Latin is another sacred language, have that transformative capability of melting away ego and putting you directly in that divine flow.
Yeah. Um, I'm a little distracted by, I don't know if you can hear the thunder behind me. Um, that's like right over our house. Um, but there's something I hold on one sec because I want to go back to something you said. Oh, I know. So when I'm gardening, I put chant music on. I'll put different kinds of chant and I will just listen to chants and then I'll find myself singing it while I'm pruning flowers or vegetables. And
Yeah,
yes, yeah,
yes. For so many years that I was studying Advaita Vedanta and the Hindu path, and almost any of those chants immediately does that. And
yes,
you're quite right. What chanting does, once you really get into a chant, is throughout the day, you find yourself chanting it, and it kind of takes up the space that mind wandering would have been in.
yes, exactly. Joan, can you talk a little bit about the spiritual mentoring that you do? I know that you keep us in practice and that you work with people from all different faiths, religious affiliations. And I'm just wondering, could you maybe tell us a little bit about like, why would people, um, what is it that draws them to spiritual mentorship and what's the relationship like?
Well, that's a wonderful question. And I'm going to start my answer by citing one of my favorite books, and that was the late John O'Donohue's book called Anamkara, which is the Celtic word for soul friend. And to be able to share your inner life with someone with no holds barred, with no expectations, to be able to say, God, I had this dream. And, the meanings that come to me, or this or that, or like when you hear my dream, what is what comes up for you? Uh, all of the discussions of our inner life, of the not only the spiritual, what we think of the spiritual as spiritual experiences, but all of life is a spiritual experience. We're constantly going through changes, through phases. Aging is its own spiritual experience. And being able to simply discuss what that is like, the difficult parts, the interesting revelatory parts, kind of the whole enchilada, or saying, okay, whatever it might be, like what we were just talking about. Maybe somebody really wants to ask that question in depth from their own life, from their own tradition. Many people say, well, I was born a Jew or a Mormon or Catholic, and these are the magical parts of it that still remain for me. And these are the wounds that remain, or the questions, or I just put it away. And now I'm looking for the meaning of life. Like, what are the big questions? What am I doing here? Where am I going? What is it to live a life well lived? What is it to integrate a whole lifetime, the dark places, the light places, and to end up with a heart full of gratitude at the grace of it all? So it's a relationship where questions like that can happen. And you never know. Sometimes in a session, we'll meditate. Sometimes in a session, there might be music. You don't know because every person is different. And of course, at all phases, we're different. I've had clients, Cheryl, that I've been with for a long time, like a decade or more. And it's like having a soulmate, somebody who loves you soul to soul, companion.
Yeah, that's beautiful. As we talk about the different things that we've spoken about already today, nature, gardening, music, meditation, using binaural beats, um, really what we're saying is how can you put more emphasis on the deeper dimensions of life? And so I can certainly see, I know I said, I wrote in my blog that the minute I learned about you doing this, I hired you on the spot. I said, do you have a spot for me? Because I know that that is really the primary important goal for me at this time in my life is to really keep a spotlight on the spiritual dimension of my life, to be present, to be a source of love and kindness and comfort at a time where a lot of people need that. I know you can identify with that, Joan. Um, and so, in some ways, for me, making a decision to enter into that relationship was like saying, this takes a prominent place in my life, right? I'm wondering, as I'm looking at the questions here, somebody was talking about, could we talk about the relationship of fear to aliveness and about how, she tends to feel a lot of fear. And I think a lot of people are feeling overwhelmed, anxious, and afraid right now. I know so many people I talk to talk about that. And they know what it is they need to do to be more present. Um, but they have a hard time doing it because they're exhausted. Now, I do want to say this. Eckhart Tolle recently was telling a story of a man who had been diagnosed with a very significant illness out of the blue, stage 4 cancer, I think it was, and he was given about a year to live. And he said that this man, after the diagnosis on his way home, instantly popped into a state of presence and stayed there for almost the whole experience of the year. He had told Eckhart about this because he was so terrified when he got the diagnosis. He instantly knew that going into the future and projecting what might happen or going into the past was only, it gave him an immediate sense of suffering, and that the only place he found peace was in the present moment. So it became this like religious, consistent practice for him, which I thought was, I mean, we've all had that, right? You have an illness, you go to get testing. Like I used to say to women I was coaching who were being tested for breast cancer, I would say to them, from the time you have the biopsy to the time you get the test results is very sacred time, because you are connected to the things that matter most and the things that don't fall away. So you better be writing down about what really matters, because you are instantly put into present moment. It's easier for you to practice that. So I'm just wondering what you would say about that, you know, finding a place of peace and comfort within ourselves during fearful times.
Well, it's important. And as you say, it can be its own portal to presence. That's for sure. 4 years ago, my husband had a heart attack, almost died on the way to the hospital. And then 3 months later, I found a tumor the size of a honeydew melon in my belly. This was during the pandemic. And during the time, first doctor was sure it was an ovarian cancer, and that is not a good thing to have. And so I obviously, being human, I went into a state of deep fear about that. And you were right. The first thing that comes up is like, I'm looking around, where is there an island of safety? Where there's some place that I can touch center. And for Gordon and me during that time, it was Karen Drucker's song, There Is Only Love. And we would put that on, and our hearts would open up. And there was such a sense of the gift and the preciousness of life that you miss in the day to day. All of a sudden, it's like written in neon. And if you are willing to work with that and abide with that, it can have a lasting effect. I'm happy to say I ended up having something called a borderline tumor, which is not cancer. It can recur, but it's not cancer. And so both of us had another chance. But then there's just generalized anxiety. I don't know, I'd say pretty much anyone who was not anxious about the world situation right now, that things are falling apart, that people are divided. And the question is, how can we hold that? Can the anxiety actually serve us in some way? And first of all, I like to tell people, yes, of course, there are ways to deal with anxiety and breathing techniques. And also, I wrote a book at one point called Fire in the Soul, how you get through these difficult times. The whole last chapter of that I called Night Lights. What are the things that return you to center? And it's great if people make a list of that. And for me, a lot of it was poems, lines of inspiration from all kinds of different sources. And I'll still open that up. When I had that tumor, I opened that up. I found a line from an old poem by the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, which a paraphrase is um, that the pain in the heart was great when, oh Master, when you were tuning my strings. So I
Yeah.
thought, that's great. I'm just having my strings tuned by the divine master of life, that the tune that plays from me will be more beautiful. But anything like that, and different things speak to different people. And that's great. I mean, you've got decks of cards, Cheryl. And so many of the things that have been centering to you get into that card deck. But if people would make their own, it would be a help. The other thing I want to say quickly about this, because I know our time is coming to a close, is that sometimes anxiety is just going to be there. And it's just a feature of this time in life. And for some people, it's a feature of life. If you let your focus narrow to just the anxiety, it's a rough ride. But to me, a lot of life is like, okay, how do I expand and get spacious? So, yes, the anxiety is there. Sometimes I'm going to feel it and be able to say to myself, here you are, old friend. There's the feeling of panic, and let myself feel it in my body. What does that anxiety feel like? And then take a few breaths and say, what else is there? And be able to hold that without denying it and without it being your whole reality. And that's where Buddhism comes in.
Yes.
They're really good at that stuff.
No, they're very, very good at that. I know. And you know the old the old saying, "What you resist persists." Last year as I was dealing with so many losses in my life, I just had to keep telling myself, "Sweetheart, embrace what is. Don't resist what is. Just be open. Let it." I love how you said, "Expand." Create a sense of expansion and let it live with everything. Let it live in space. I can tell by some of the questions in this chat are really important ones. And I'm thinking maybe, Joan, at some point in the next few months, you could come back and we could do another conversation. I'll hang on to the chat. I had a really great idea for everybody based on what you just said, and that is what a beautiful commitment to one's spiritual life if all of us decided to make some kind of journal of comfort, right? A journal that is dedicated to capturing the lines that you read in a book, like you were saying, or the poetry. I have a year of Rumi book, and every now and then there will be a poem or a line in that book where I think it, yeah, it just opens you up. It connects you. And it might be, messages to yourself, inspirational messages to yourself, photographs. I mean, whatever would keep you connected to a higher, deeper state of life. I think I'm going to do that. I wrote that down. I think it's a great idea, and I would encourage everybody listening to consider doing something like that. And it just can be a project over time. It's not like, okay, you've got 30 days to complete your journal of comfort. No, it's just a separate journal where you capture, maybe you hear about a song from someone. Joan, would you be willing, somebody asked in the questions, would you send me the Jewish chant, the Hebrew chant that you listened to, that you sang for us?
I can tell you where to find it. You go to Apple Music or Spotify or whatever, and
Pandora, thank you so
name
much.
of the person is Richard Gans. He has a whole album of call and response chants that are Hebrew, because that's unusual. Usually they're Sanskrit, or Pali, but Hebrew, and it's called Elohai, Elohai. Neshama, Neshama. Neshama is soul in Hebrew. Elohai is like the personal sense of the divine.
Mhm.
So it's like, God, my soul, the soul that you have put within me is pure. And it is a lovely chant.
And Richard Gans, is it Gans?
NS.
Right. So, and again, this is being recorded so you all can get that. And Terry, maybe you can put that in the chat box for me, and then we'll remember that. I'm going to just look. I know we have just a couple of minutes left. Well, let me ask you this, Joan. So, if people want to learn more about your spiritual mentoring or your work, because you've written so many, I love your book. I've read all your books, and I love A Pocket Full of Miracles, which is a great daily book for people to have. And also, A Woman's Journey to God was a wonderful, wonderful book. So I'm assuming they can go to your website, joanborysenko.com.
Borysenko.com. And there is, if you look on the tabs at the top, there's a tab that says spiritual mentoring, which will give you a better idea of what it is if you are interested. And for those people who might be interested, the process begins with us just spending maybe a half an hour together and seeing if we're resonant, each of us determining, does this feel like what my soul needs right now? And then we would go from there. But I would say, Cheryl, you put your finger on the importance of having a mentor at any time in your life, because what it does is it's a vehicle for your intention to say, this is important to me, putting a spotlight on my spiritual life at this moment in time is what I really want to do. And especially if you do that twice a month, it keeps it front and center for you. So that's part of why I wanted to offer it at this time in life. I'm about to be 80, and this is the time, I think, for mentoring others. I used to travel all the time. Now I'm pretty much in my home space. And so I have the time and space to really devote to my own spiritual life in this latter phase of life. And it seemed the overflow of that gift that I have could serve others who are also interested in that.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, Joan, so much for being here. And thank you, everybody. I know there are questions in the chat that are too deep for me to give a minute or two. So I'm going to keep them. Questions about, end of life and what do you do when you don't have children? You know, um, I think I am going to do a Zoom gathering on death and dying at some point, and it would be good, Joan, for you and I maybe to do a follow-up Zoom around, you know, because this conversation is directly linked to um, lessening our fear of death, both in terms of losing others and our own death. Because the more you become connected to a greater consciousness, the more you understand what you understood when you talked about mathematics and music and expanded consciousness. There are a whole lot of people that have had pretty incredible, undeniable experiences that pretty much have confirmed for me that we are so much more than this physical lifetime. I mean, we just are. And that's what I want for everybody, right? Is to have that sense of, oh, when you have a moment of unity consciousness, you never forget it.
Over.
You never
Exactly.
forget it. And you always want to return to it. It's the inspiration. And the reason is because it connects you to your origin, which is that we are each just, like you said, God is, okay, I'm going to end with this. You talked about God having multiple personality disorder. The other night, Michael and I went to see a comedian. We like to go see comedians during stressful times. It's a smart thing to do, I think. So we were at, I think the comedian's name was Peter Holmes. I'm not positive about that. But he did something really, part of the reason we went to see him is he does a whole comedy piece on the afterlife that's smart and funny. And so he tends to be existential in his thinking, and I like that. So Michael and I were there, and it was a lot of like typical humor, and he was funny, and we were laughing. And then we were kind of waiting for that piece of like existential humor that we would really like, and the gold hit right towards the end. I'm not going to do him justice, but what he said was something like he was talking about God and religion and how we're all trying to figure out like what happens when you die? Who am I really? Who created me? What is this universe that I look out at when I'm looking at a night sky? And and he was talking about how different religions will say, this is what God is. This is where you go. You go to heaven, you go to hell, you go to the, the perk, whatever. Like, You don't go anywhere. Like, you go back into energy, whatever. And he said, we've got to stop trying to tell everybody, like, we are the ones that were created. And we think we can speak for the creator when in fact we can't. He said that would be like Harry Potter in the middle of the whole Harry Potter, in the middle of a Harry Potter book, telling the reader what J.K. Rowling is doing. Harry doesn't know what J.K. Rowling is doing because Harry is a product of J.K. Rowling. Only J.K. Rowling knows what's going on. And Harry won't know until like, and I thought, yeah, that's what's happening here. We are part of a great existential experiment, um, a great loving presence, expansive, loving presence that is undefinable.
Yes.
It can be felt with the heart, and it can be felt with the being when we bring ourselves to those places. And that's what this conversation is about, giving ourselves the best shot at having a glimpse into what J.K. Rowling or God might be thinking. um, and
Great.
experiencing the comfort of that, Anyway, I love you, Joan Borysenko. You're such a gift to this world. Your loving presence in and of itself is a real gift. And I know that everyone here joins me in thanking you for spending this hour with us for sure. Yes, let's open it up to the gallery view, and you can see people smiling and clapping their hands. And thank you everybody for being with us, for coming again. You all show up every time, and I so appreciate that. I really do feel like we have a great community here. And I'll look forward to our next Zoom gathering. And Joan, I will look forward to our next conversation, you and I. Thank you, everybody. Lots of love.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thanks, everybody. Mwah.
Bye.
Bye.